introduce myself. I'm David Swanson, campaign coordinator at Roots Action Education Fund. This is our monthly online book club, 8 p.m. Eastern, first Wednesday of every month. This is the third ever, and many more are to come. You can find them at teachinnetwork.org/book clubs. Greg Grandin is the Peter V. and C. Van Woodward Professor of History at Yale University. He is the author of prize-winning books, Pulitzer Prize winning The End of the Myth, one of his wonderful books. And the book we are talking about today is America, América, A New History of the New World. Please put your questions in the chat at any time, and I will ask them for you. Greg Grandin, welcome to the book club.
Thanks for having me, and I'm glad we managed to get the. Maybe that's better. I mean, I'm glad I'm on my iPhone because my computer is glitching. It's not better because I'm looking at the wrong thing. That's better. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for being here. So this book, for those who can see me, I'm holding it up. It's wonderful. I hope you all have read it. It's okay if you haven't, but put your questions about it or about what we discuss into the chat, and I'll ask them. This new history seems to be a history of contrasts between North America and Latin America, and British and Spanish colonialism, but also of connections and influences between the two. What was your thinking in putting this together?
Oh, well, I teach Latin American history, but I teach more than that. I teach, I'm very much interested in U.S. relations in Latin America, and it's been an ongoing concern, and obviously it's an area in which quite an eventful area of study in terms of coups and regime changes, and U.S. projecting its power into Latin America, and these were a lot of the ideas in the book. Have been percolating and circulating for quite a long time, and I just wanted to pull everything together. I mean, one of the main questions, everybody talks about American exceptionalism, and American exceptionalism means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and it usually pertains specifically to the United States, right? Some people think of it as the United States has an exceptional mission in the world, or that its history is exceptional in the sense that it's the richest, most prosperous, most powerful polity in world history, or it's exceptional in it hasn't except for the Civil War, it hasn't succumbed to the kind of crisis politics that overcome other many other countries, and that it resolves its conflicts within the two-party system. I think of American exceptionalism as something a little bit differently. I think of it as an exceptional devotion to the idea of individual rights, to political rights. And what I mean by that is that you think of citizen rights in two different ways. You could think of them in terms of social rights and economic rights, and you could think of them as political rights or individual rights. And the United States, its Constitution is a famous defender of individual rights. It's very prescriptive in keeping the state at bay and allowing as much individual freedom as possible, with the idea that virtue will spring from that freedom. So you have the right to believe, there's to assemble. These are all things that require the state to do less, to do or nothing. Leave citizen alone as much as possible. But most of the other world balance that conception of rights with a conception of rights that are more social and more economic, that require the state to do something, to actually act, to tax, to capture surplus value and redistribute it in the form of a social wage. And so you have the right to education, the right to healthcare, the right to a good pension, the right to a dignified life, a whole set of economic rights. And what is exceptional about the United States is that it is ideologically committed to considering that class of rights as illegitimate and perverse. And conversely, in Latin America, social rights have defined democracy, economic rights, even to the point where they define democracy as being more important than political rights and proceduralism and the right to vote. Although for the most part, their constitutions try to balance the two. And so one of the things that the book tried to do is, and I know there's a long answer to your question, is get at the heart of this exceptionalism, but in the United States, but in relationship to Latin America. So I also think that one of the things that makes the United States exceptional isn't just that it applies it to this kind of cultish adherence to individual rights, but that its relationship with Latin America is exceptional. No other empire has had such an intimate, close relationship with the people that with the informal in the United States or so colonies. And so I try to look at that history going back to the conquest and going the Spanish conquest and the British conquest and coming forward. So that's a long opening bid, but I'll end there for now, and I have more to say.
Well, it is a long story over centuries in the book, and it's very interesting how you contrast the British colonists here, where I am in the eastern United States, and the Spanish further south, and relations to indigenous peoples, for example. And you talk about the writers and the preachers up here almost pretending that the native peoples didn't exist at all. And Spain, I was very interested. You sort of give Spain a good deal of credit for allowing harsh criticisms of its own atrocities. It's like the first empire to commit outrages and critique itself at the same time. Can you talk about that
Yeah.
contrast?
So I don't, but I'm not. I do not in any way, shape, or form deny the atrocities and the horrors of the Spanish conquest, the Spain presided over what some demographers call the greatest human mortality event in history. The Spanish themselves thought that maybe there was 100 million people living in all the Americas in the early 1500s. Within a century, 90% of them were gone. The population had dropped by 90%. And the first wave of violence was conquistador violence, the rapacious drive for gold and to enslave Native Americans first, and then Africans to extract gold, pan for gold, dig for gold, pearls, silver, then agriculture. Spain created an extractive empire that pulled the riches of the New World out and channeled them to Europe. But at the same time, as it was doing that, because it wasn't just the Spanish Empire, it was the Spanish Catholic Empire. And Catholicism, this was, presumed to be a universal religion, presumed to be the bearer of all the world's wisdom, all the world's history, going back to Adam and Eve, going back to creation, and and it never denied that there was no doctrine of empty land that the Spaniards used to justify taking over the Americas. Right? And within the Spanish colonial system, there emerged a cohort of critics that my argument is that gave birth to political modernity, that challenged the idea of conquest, challenged the idea of dispossession. By what right does Spain presume to preside over the New World? By what right does it enslave Native Americans? By what right does it wage war against Native American peoples? By what right does it enslave African Americans? Now, these criticisms by no means slowed the the horrors of the conquest, the cutting off of limbs, the crippling of, people in war. I mean, all sorts of horrors. The feeding children to dogs to give them the taste of blood. I mean, the horrors of the conquest were almost beyond description. But 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 the critique mattered because the people mattered. Spain had to justify itself, because it presumed to be a universal religion, and so the people of the Americas were the main thing in the sense that they extracted all the wealth, but they were the main moral thing. They were the main, they had to find a justification within Catholic universalism, and that critique of conquest by a small cohort of Dominicans and Franciscans and theologians and priests, de Bartolome de las Casas, who is a big figure in the book, in the first part of the book, being the primary driver, was important because it really did set the terms for how Spain justified itself. They had to figure out ways to answer the critics, and they created an empire that recognized that accepted the premise that there were no in that Native Americans were not subhuman, that they were equal in reason and consciousness with Europeans, and then I contrast that with the British Empire and the British Imperial Project, which took place about started really got going a century later, which was premised on denial and evasion. I have a great document in the book in which the Virginia Company in 1607, they met to decide whether they were going to put out a proclamation to justify setting up their colonies in what were Virginia and then eventually in New England, and they had a long 3 day debate, and they said, and the debate was all about the Spanish. They basically said the Spanish have been arguing about this for a century, and they can't come up with a decent justification for conquest and enslavement, so it's better we don't say anything. And the nature of the British colonial project, and I don't want to deny the importance of Native Americans first in slavery. Many of them were enslaved before the African transatlantic slavery got started, or later in the fur trade. But Native Americans were not the main thing for British Puritans, for the divines and the select and the saints. They were kind of like shadow players in stories the Puritans told about themselves. And this invasion and this kind of pushing Native Americans back along the frontier set the terms of Anglo colonialism. And not to put, well, because we only have an hour and I've already spent too long on this answer, this is really where I root the distinction between the intellectual and social origins of one empire that eventually produces social rights and another empire that clings to individual rights, is this the Spain had a notion that individuals lived collectively in society, and that you didn't have individualism without society. Whereas in the Anglos could presume, they showed up and they thought they were the bee's knees, and eventually any kind of collectivism that defined Protestantism fell to the wayside, and a certain kind of individualism forged in race violence on the frontier became the foundation of the individual rights tradition that I talked about earlier.
It was interesting to me, Greg Grandin, to read that in Latin America, unlike in the North, the conquistadors, when they would die in the 16th century, would often confess their part in the conquest, not having strayed from the good, acceptable terms of the conquest into bizarre atrocities, but the conquest itself, and this
Yeah.
tradition of public confessions that almost seems like a precursor to Truth and Reconciliation commissions, and it was unheard of up
Yeah,
here.
good. Yeah, that was, well, Bartolome de las Casas was tireless advocate for. He came over. His uncles and father sailed with Christopher Columbus. He came to Hispaniola in 1503. He was already a priest. He thought he'd set himself up as a priest merchant. He received an allotment of Native Americans, an encomienda, which was effectively slavery. And after being in Hispaniola for about 10 years, the scales fell from his eyes, and he realized that what was going on was an enormous violation of the commandment, thou shalt not steal. And he spent the rest of his life advocating in defense of Native Americans in any way he could. He was well versed in canon law, he was well versed in the philosophy of the ancients, Aristotle, as well as Catholic neo Aristotelism. St. Thomas Aquinas and people like that. And he used whatever argument he could, including personal witness, to constantly make the argument to end slavery, to allow Native Americans to rule over themselves. I mean, he believed that, that Catholicism, the Catholic Church had a right to be in the Americas, but Spanish conquest was. But by the time he reached the end of a very long life, he died in his 80s. He spent a lot of time in the Americas, but then he spent the second half of his life in Spain, finding any kind of strategy he could. So he came up with this idea of using the confessional as a form of restitution of reparations, we might say. He had a lot of followers. He had a lot of followers within the Dominican order, particularly in Peru, where the conquest was especially violent. I mean, it was violent everywhere, but the Pizarro brothers, were a bunch of gangsters, and he started writing these rule books for confessors to hear confessions, and basically it was all about defining the conquest as one giant act of theft, and that conquistadors were required under the pain of hellfire to return what they had gotten. And it didn't work exactly the way that he wanted it to. He hoped that it would actually reverse the conquest. um, the conquistadores, many of them were indeed worried for their souls. They did, they found ways around it. They donated money to hospitals, they donated money to orphanages, in the name of their sins for the conquest, or they argued in good faith that, that we didn't, that we acted in good faith. We didn't know the conquest was unjust when we carried it out. That kind of argument. But yeah, politicization of the confessional was one of De las Casas's most disruptive and subversive strategies of trying to reverse the conquest, and it caused all sorts of commotions in Peru. And I mean, long after Las Casas was dead, this was going on, and the Spanish crown spent quite a considerable amount of effort to stamp out what they believed to be the ongoing influence of Las Casas, especially in Peru, a place he never visited, by the way.
But you give Las Casas and some of these other writers from what we call Latin America credit for really helping develop the very idea of international law, and in a very different way from the Dutch and British writers that are more of us have heard of. But they weren't separate. These people read each other's books, even if they twisted them in different ways, right?
Yeah, so people like Hugo Grotius, Dutch jurist, jurist, and others are often credited with the beginnings of international law. But they read the Spaniards. They read Francisco Vitoria. They read Ramon Suarez. They read Bartolome de las Casas. They knew the arguments that Vittoria was making, and many of the Northern European jurists who get credit for creating international law were really trying to figure workarounds around Victoria's absolutism. Victoria came to the point of like saying all war was illegal, and they had to figure out ways to justify waging war. More importantly, though, was the Spanish independence movement. So, jump forward a couple of centuries, and the United States breaks free of Great Britain, and a generation later, a much more violent and prolonged war of independence leads to the breaking away of Spanish America from Spain. And so you have, on the one hand, you have the United States, a nation that its founders believed existed on an empty continent, or empty enough. They obviously there were Native American sovereignties. There was Spain, there was Mexico, there was France, but the founders of the United States knew the United States was going to make it to the Pacific. Not for nothing, they both often called their country America and the whole continent America. It was aspirational. They knew they would reach the Pacific. And the quest. Basically throughout the 19th century, the wars against Native Americans, the wars against Mexico were all justified by the doctrine of conquest. Spanish Americans, though, come into the world already a community of nations, 7 independent republics, and Brazil, which is a monarchy, but it's independent from Portugal. And they have to learn how to live with each other. It's not an empty continent, it's a continent that's all filled up. And they develop a critique of both the United States' doctrine of conquest, and they develop a critique of Europeans' kind of realpolitik balance of power. They believed that nations were not inherently competitive, that they were sister republics, that they had more in common than in opposition, and that if they were to survive, they would have to learn to live with each other. And in particular, they couldn't base their sovereignty on the United States' doctrine of sovereignty, which was the doctrine of conquest. Because if they did, then what would stop Argentina from just saying, we want to get to the Pacific too, and rolling over Chile to get to the Pacific. And so they came up with this idea. They came up. They effectively came into the world already a League of Nations, already a United Nations. Some people trace the idea of national sovereignty to Westphalia in the 17th century, or to the post-Napoleonic settlement in the early 1800s. But those weren't nations in Europe. Those were fledgling empires. They're sending their warships into the Indian Ocean, setting up slave trade routes, setting up proto-colonies and then real colonies, beginning the establishment of Europe's domination over most of the world. Spanish America were actually bounded nations. They didn't have empires. They didn't have colonies. They didn't, and so in many ways, it was the first modern community of nations, a league of nations, and they all of the principles that go into founding the United Nations in 1945 are in place in Latin America in the 1820s and 30s. One, the prohibition against aggressive war. Two, the need to respect boundaries. Three, the idea that emancipation and slavery was unjust. Four, most importantly, was the idea that there was some transcendent value that bound the nations together, that they should cooperate rather than compete with each other. And more importantly, when they confronted the United States, not only did they have to learn to live with each other, look who they had north above them, the United States, that was moving across North America like a whirligig, taking Mexico, taking Native American lands, taking Florida, annexing Texas, you know, and the thing is that the Spanish Americans already had a critique of the conquest. So there was just an updating of that critique, but applied now to the United States. And so that tension in which Latin America spent for so long trying to force the United States to give up the right of the doctrine of conquest and give up the right of intervention was is a big element of the book, a big part of the book.
Want to remind everyone to keep putting their questions in the chat at any time. It's very interesting, Greg, that you're sort of finding the origin of the rule of law and international relations in the modern world in Latin America, where the current president of the United States says nothing but criminals come from this place and criminally
Yeah,
invade the North. No,
and the
actually,
accusations,
law,
the confession.
law comes from there. But there was a time in the book where Simon Bolivar proposes a Congress in Panama with sister nations, a League of Nations that would agree to mutual defense, condemn Spain for the suffering it's caused, promote independence for Cuba, Puerto Rico, Canary Islands, Philippines, repudiate the doctrines of discovery and conquest, abolish slavery, recognize Haiti, legalize agreed upon borders. How did this go, and what was the U.S. reaction?
Well, that Congress didn't go very well. It was Panama wanted Bolivar wanted Panama for symbolic reasons. He thought Panama stood at the crossroads of what would be a world confederation, between Asia and Africa, between the United States and Latin America, and but 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 August in lowlands Panama is not is quite a malarial place, and you know and Bolivar was having a lot of problems maintaining stability within the newly independent Latin Spanish American nations. But within the United States, what it did was it really when John Quincy Adams, the seventh president, sixth president, seventh president, I don't know, he of the United States, he accepted Bolivar's invitation to attend, and it galvanized in Congress a reaction mostly from Southerners, because Southerners knew what Bolivar was up to when he talked about emancipation, when he talked about recognizing Haiti, and this is really the beginning of a kind of fear among a certain kind of American firsters or nationalists that international law would be used in order to socialize the United States and integrate the United States. So there was a 6-month theatrical debate within Congress about um, whether whether the United States should attend this Congress. And what are they going to do? Sit next to African American diplomats? John Randolph from Virginia, a senator, mistakenly thought that Guatemalans were all from Africa, and and so the horror of this binds the kind of beginnings of the Jacksonian coalition, and which they really start to define Anglo-Saxonism in opposition to what they imagine to be a Mongol or mestizo or African Latin Spanish America. This really was the beginning of this kind of racialized Anglo-Saxonism, and just the opposition to it kind of conjures the Jacksonian coalition. And of course, John Quincy Adams is a one-term president. Andrew Jackson becomes the next president, and and the United States is off to the races. The Indian Removal Act, the various homesteading acts, and letting the settlers run wild, run west, and then putting everything into motion, the annexation of Texas, the invasion of Mexico and the genocide in California, all under the Jacksonians.
When I tell anyone these days in the United States that I'm not very fond of wars, and then I go through 30, 45 minutes of debunking misunderstandings about World War II, usually the next thing out of anyone's mouth is the US Civil War. You must be for slaughtering 750,000 people in some fields and then ending slavery, or you're for slavery. How did slavery end in the rest of the Americas?
Well, um, it in different ways in different countries. In some countries like Chile and Mexico, slavery ended with independence in the 1820s, almost immediately. There was a general presumption that independence from Spain meant emancipation of all forms of slavery, not just of chattel slavery, of African Americans from the transatlantic trade system, but also the tribute system of Native Americans and the various forms of coarse labor that Native Americans were imposed on, and that was all to go with independence. Now, of course, in every country, depending on the power relations that happened or sooner or later. Some countries slavery lasted for quite a long time, but there were no wars to end slavery, and there was also no second slavery. There was no period in which the liberalization of Atlantic trade and the invention of the cotton gin and the demand for cotton by textile manufacturers in New England and in Manchester led to increased slavery in Latin America. In the Caribbean, maybe you can make that argument for sugar. There was an intensification of slavery, but no, you saw nothing like what happened with the combined Western movement across the frontier and the expansion of slavery down into the Mississippi bottoms, into Louisiana, into Texas, and the hardening of slavery into the monstrous system that it became in the 1830s, and the 1840s, and the 1850s. You saw none of that in Latin America. There were a number of limiting factors. I think part of it was ideology. I think that there was no will to ratchet up slavery as an institution, even if some countries took longer than others to end it. There was a general sense that slavery had to end.
Yeah. Uh, One of the very most interesting bits in this incredibly long and rich book was learning about a man named Juan Bautista Alberdi, who I had never heard of. I'm very ashamed to confess, who not only developed a system of international law, but wrote a book in 1870 that I've since read that outpaces most books today on war and peace. That was for the outlawing of war long before the outlawry movement, the criminalization of war, the abolition of war, with all the relevant arguments that are still so badly needed today. How do we not know about this guy?
A lot. There's a lot of these Latin American jurists who develop what they call American international law. They understand themselves as developing a new they understand themselves as reforming the international system, and part of it had to do with, frankly, to be honest, the chaos that Latin American countries were not stable. They were chronically in debt. You know, Bolivar was right that, these countries are ruled by a small group of landed class and that would be unwilling to give up power or to be taxed, and a large mass of
Well, we've gone from poor connection to no connection. Oh, he's back. Greg, you're back but muted. Are you able to unmute?
That's okay. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes.
Okay.
The
Um,
connection has been spotty this entire time, by the way, but you just disappeared entirely for a couple seconds there.
yeah, I had to rejoin the meeting. I don't know why. Um, Maybe because my Zoom on my iPhone is limited. I don't know for time limited as opposed to my Yale account, which isn't working. But anyway, what I was saying is that there was a sense, even as every country, many countries did experience quite a hard time establishing domestic political stability. They developed a kind of foreign policy cadre, ministry of professional diplomats, and many of them saw that the way the way that they had a chance of establishing domestic stability was reforming the international order, because a lot of the instability had to do with debt collection and sending the gunboats into Venezuela, and so they came up with quite a number of of international innovations that gradually they wrote textbooks, and they studied in France. They wrote textbooks in France, like Alberta, and their ideas filtered into international law. And a lot of these, and as I said earlier, a lot of these ideas you can trace the origins to the critique of the Spanish conquest. And certainly Alberta's book on war, in which I think it's called The Crime of War, where he's like, you can't have a law of war. It's ridiculous. It's like saying you're gonna have a law of murder. There should be no, just like there should be no murder, there should be no war. That was his argument.
Well, here in Charlottesville, Virginia, Greg, they have a U.S. Army Law School, an entire school for lawyers of war.
Yeah, I'm sure that no one's told them that about the doctrine of conquest. But well, but so just in 1902, 1903, when Germany, France, Italy, the UK, and the Dutch sent their gunboats to Venezuela to try to collect debt. People like Luis Drago from Argentina and Carlos Calvo, they began to argue against the idea of militarized collection of debt. And interestingly enough, the United States, even though they resisted Latin America's the idea that Latin America could that there could be a thing called the American international law. The United States like to say there's internet. You can't have a regional international law. There's just international law, and international law says the doctrine of conquest is valid. So enough of this, And Latin America's kept on saying, well, this is American international law, and we're out to reform it, and but the United States eventually accepts some of the principles, because the United States by the 1900s, they don't want German warships off the coast of Venezuela. They don't want Italian warships trying to collect debt from the Dominican Republic. So they gradually start accepting the doctrines of Latin Americans. So you see, there's like you see it's very dialectical in how these and then by the time you get to the League of Nations, I mean, Woodrow Wilson's vision of the League of Nations is entirely a product of Latin America, and I talk about this quite a bit in the book. Latin America's explicit. I mean, Woodrow Wilson explicitly says it. He credits Latin American Pan Americanism. If you want to know what we want to do in Versailles, look.
I'm not getting any audio at the moment.
Oh, you didn't hear me?
I, I'm missing little bits the entire time, but I'm just missing a good chunk here. So
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, you don't want me to answer that question again, do you?
Well, let's leave our buddy Woodrow Wilson from out west of here and go back even a little to 1907 in The Hague. The peace conference, 18 of the 44 nations were from Latin America, and a lot of the ideas I think your book shows came from Latin America.
Yeah, yeah. That was that's the argument. I mean, in all of these instances, whether it be The Hague, whether it be the League of Nations, whether it be the United Nations, Latin America forms the largest regional caucus, but they also have the most coherent set of proposals of what the new world should look like.
And
The Hague falls apart um, over the question of representation, right? The perennial question of like, is it going to be one country, one vote? And does Haiti get a vote? And does the United States get a vote? And of course, the great powers aren't going to let that happen. And so the Hague, the Second Hague Conference kind of falls apart over the question of arbitration. The League of Nations come up with a cumbersome, and of course, the United States comes up with the Security Council and the veto.
and Latin American nations really wanted a fair and equitable League of Nations and didn't get it, but joined anyway until they thought it was really becoming imperialistic, and then they started leaving it, right?
Yeah, yeah, they just felt like, I mean, they all joined because a lot of them were Wilsonians, even if the final product was a very conservative version of what they thought, from what was originally proposed, leaving colonialism in place, creating, the mandatory powers over Palestine and Syria and all sorts of things. But but they joined. They willingly joined, and they created things like committees on health, you know, public health and communications, transportation. But eventually, the League of Nations became very ineffectual, especially around the Spanish Civil War. Um, uh, the Spanish Civil War ironically invoked the doctrine of non-intervention, which of course Latin Americans liked and had long wanted the United States to accept, to stay out of the Spanish Civil War. But many Latin Americans wanted the League of Nations to intervene on the side of the Republicans. But and so by that point the um, the the institution was largely moribund. Um, last the what the last nation to be in to remain in the League of Nations was Haiti. Haiti was the last nation in the League of Nations.
There's a question in the chat about efforts to form one big Grand Colombia, enormous nation in South America, because there were these dreams, these intentions, and even though the separate nations as sisters not at war with each other creates this model for the future, that wasn't everyone's original hope, was it?
Well, it's complicated. Bolivar imagined eventually that republicanism would become expansive and universal, and there would be a world federation of republics that were bound together. I mean, that was his great hope, but mostly I mean, Bolivar swung between these incredibly ambitious utopian dreams and these deep dark thoughts that everything was pointless. He Latin America is a very contradictory place. There's a lot of attachment to local nations, or your own. There was also a sense of nationalism, that eventually became Argentina, what eventually became Chile. There was a Grand Colombia that corresponded to the viceroyalty Santa Fe, Bogota, that included Ecuador, bits of Peru, uh, Colombia, and Venezuela. That was an existing nation. It began to splinter around the last years of Bolivar's life, and contributed to his giving up and attempting to seek exile in France. But the thing about the things about Latin American nationalism, which is an historical question, um, is Latin Americans nationalism in Latin America, for the most part, things are changing a little bit with the rise of the Trumpian right in Latin America. But for the most part, Latin American nationalism was not seen in the kind wasn't never developed a kind of toxic variant. This is the way I like to think. That I mean, this is a way to illustrate the contrast, right? Germany had a critique of Great Britain. Germany was spiritual, it was humanist, it had all of those romantic philosophers and subjectivist philosophers, going back to the 19th century, Hegel and whatnot. It saw Great Britain as keeping Germany down, as being utilitarian and materialistic and capitalist. Latin America had the same critique of the United States. That, in fact, the name Latin America was, adopted to kind of capture this complex of values. That Latin America was more humanist, more spiritual, more diaphanous, more more universal, more emancipationist, as opposed to Saxonist, enslaving I don't care about actually. Um, but we know what happened to German Romanticism. We know what that evolved into. That evolved into Nazism, right? That evolved into fascism, eliminationist nationalism. That never happened in Latin America. Latin America never developed a kind of eliminationist nationalism. Its idea of nationalism was always seen as compatible with internationalism. In fact, that nationalism was kind of a stepping stone to internationalism. And so it's very interesting. I mean, Latin America, with the blowback from neoliberalism. There's many countries that have developed a very grievous nationalism. In the Philippines, Israel, China, Turkey, the United States. Latin Americans don't blame the depredations of neoliberalism on the globalists, right? They have a very clear understanding of unequal development and economic exploitation. They don't blame it on the Jews. It's their internet. They still hold to a certain kind of universalism or internationalism, and you see it in Lula, you see it in Scheinbaum in Mexico. Um, that said, the penetration of a kind of Trumpian cultural politics has in a number of countries has changed that, has begun to erode that. We'll see if it holds or what happens.
Well, they're all going to get Nobel Peace Prizes, I think. But
Right.
even if you look today at if you look at the world for where is there a nuclear free zone? Where are there countries that support human rights and disarmament treaties and the International Criminal Court? Where does everybody oppose the war in Gaza and refuse to join either side of the war in Ukraine? I mean, it seems like even today, in terms of being good international citizens, despite all kinds of deep flaws in Latin America, it's a place you ought to be learning from more than blowing up boats.
Yeah. I mean, and that's one of the arguments of the book, that that despite all of all of the hardships and despite all of the very real problems, the crime and the corruption and the drugs, a lot of it not unrelated to U.S. policy, but that's another long story. Um, despite the success of Pinochet's coup in 1973 and the power of the Chicago Boys, most Latin Americans don't think that national health care will lead to the gulag, will lead to serfdom. Most Latin Americans think that some form of economic, the state provision of a dignified life is part of democracy. And I think that that's one of the main lessons that we can draw from.
When Donald Trump, we've got not that many minutes left here, Greg. When Donald Trump and his supporters excuse murdering anyone on 15, 20 boats now at this point near Venezuela. They don't talk about it as being Venezuela. They talk about it as being the area under the command of the Southern Command.
Yeah,
It doesn't seem, I mean,
yeah,
another local boy here in Charlottesville, James Monroe, his doctrine doesn't seem to have faded one iota.
no, no, it's still a hinterland. I mean, the bigger picture of this is if I'm, and we don't really have too much time to talk about it, but if one of the premises of America First is that the United States no longer is responsible for superintending a global order organized around international laws controlling trade and property rights, in which the United States kind of supervises that global order. The American First is that you retreat back into your sphere of interest, and the world is a series of fractured sovereignties in which regional hegemons, preside over their own hinterlands. So Russia can have Eurasia, and China can have the China Sea, and maybe even Taiwan, and the United States gets Latin America. So what's going on with policy is figuring out, like, how do you organize Latin America under a U.S. hegemony? And it's difficult because if you don't have Brazil and you don't have Mexico, you don't have Latin America. I mean, you might have El Salvador, you might have Ecuador, maybe they'll get Chile back, but you know, the economies of Brazil and Mexico are really the anchors of Latin America. And if you don't have that, you don't have Latin America. And so, uh, it's the hesitation to do. I mean, there are people in the Trump administration, Rubio among them, that sees it in ideological terms. They want to go after Venezuela because they want finally to end the Cuban Revolution. God damn, it's been six decades. It's enough. They're still obsessed with it, and Venezuela is the first step to that. But there's other people in the Trump administration, believe it or not, that are a little bit, I wouldn't call them moderates, but they have other priorities, and their priorities is stability and getting access to Venezuela's oil, maybe without a bloody civil war or a bloody war. Because certainly Maduro has offered to basically open up the country's oil. So um, and of course, the real goal is to end the kind of independence that you see among Lula in Brazil, and they lost that battle, right? The Bolsonaros are in jail, and it doesn't seem like they're getting out of jail anytime soon. And and Lula is going to stand for re-election, and he may very well win. Uh, Next year, and it's not a sign of a healthy democracy because Lula's pretty old and he's no obvious successor, but but um but Brazil and Mexico are really the countries that the United States have to figure out how to bring back into the fold.
Just a couple minutes left. What are the possibilities of, on the contrary, getting the other countries out of the fold, ceasing to openly buy elections with tens of billions of dollars and to choose candidates and to put military bases into Colombia and Ecuador and the rest of the region. What are the chances of actually liberating the rest of Latin America?
Yeah, well, it's an ongoing dream and it's an ongoing struggle, and but like I said, that there is a social base for Trumpism in Latin America. I mean, we see it in Argentina, we see it, you know, you know, and we see it in El Salvador, and we see it in Ecuador. Uh, you know, but the thing about Trumpism, unlike Reaganism, when Reagan's anti-communism really did manage to organize the hemisphere, Trump, Trumpism kind of works against itself, in Latin America. And the more, if it invades Venezuela, then I think that, it it's not, that's not going to do the same thing that the invasion of Panama did for George H.W. Bush, which was like seal, the reorganization of the hemisphere that began under Reagan completely, and then open the way for the free trade invasion as well, and coherent crisis.
You're breaking up quite a lot. I hope that people in Latin America and the rest of the globe are reading America, America, which is not going to inspire Trumpish sentiments. Quite the contrary, and that's a very, very good thing. Greg Grandin, thank you so much for taking the time to fit this in your schedule, and for writing this incredible book.
Oh, thanks so much, Dave. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it very much, and it was a nice conversation.
Okay, thanks. Thanks to everyone. Good night.
Good night.